Hi, hello. I am Megan. I am our new executive director here at the Omaha Conservatory of Music. And there's a lot of staff members here, including our artistic director, our programming director, our development director, our admissions folks. Like, if you're here and you're on staff, would you wave so people can ask you questions later? Yeah. Find these humans and they'll answer lots of wonderful things about the conservatory that I might not even know yet. So we're going to talk a little bit today about chaos to rhythm and what that means, but I'm also going to tell you a little bit about me because I'm new to town, so we'll do that. So this is me. I am a theater artist, a teaching artist, and facilitator. I actually feel the most comfortable facilitating and directing. Those are the things that I feel like are my artistic jam. But I'm also, somehow I became an arts leader and administrator. I didn't like, in my pajamas as a child, like lay there looking at the stars thinking like, someday I'll look at budget spreadsheets and I'll talk to donors. And that wasn't really the driving force that got me here. But what I found over time was that I did have a knack for those things and that might be something that I could do to help my community in different kinds of ways. A little bit more about me. This is the humans and the animals I come from. I have a husband who loves the fact that the irony of my being here today is that I have no rhythm. He tells me all the time in the car to like, you know, just tap your foot with this song. And I try and I fail miserably and I cannot keep the beat and he laughs and I do it with a lot of vim and vigor. And then this is my family, and the reason I bring them in there is my parents that are up there. I'm a very lucky person to have had really wonderful, supportive parents, and it's part of why I wanted to be here at the conservatory, because this is a community that is about family. It is about making sure that parents and children have strong connections. And these are the humans that set out a pattern in my life, right? They set out a rhythm in my life that kind of allowed me to be a little bit of a chaotic human being, right? Like when I couldn't get things right the first time, they were just like, yeah, oh my God, that weird thing you just did, that's great. Who cares that you didn't do that other thing? So I feel really fortunate that they set up sort of roots and an understanding of how you can create safety for another human being so that they can be who they're supposed to be. Yeah. And that's my cat. She's Maxine, and she is saucy. So we're going to talk a little bit about chaos. Like I said, I think I tend to be a little bit of a chaos junkie. Like I love when something is a mess and when it feels like we can't see the end and all the pieces are maybe coming at you all at once. For some reason inside of that, there's like a real sharp focus for me. And so over the years, I've tried to embrace that, like, that is okay. That is an okay way to be, and that there's a lot of value in that. But what you can't do is that forever. And that is something that I started to realize as I moved through my career, right, is that there were not only organizations, but part of my art form was sort of like thriving on just like high intensity, jumping from one thing to the next thing. And while that was wonderful to an extent, at some point I had to figure out like, what are the pieces of this that really make sense? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've had to do some self-reflection over the years with something that I maybe don't internally have a strong sense of, right? I don't have a strong sense of like pattern in my life. I don't have a strong sense of like, that intensity can't go on for that long. That a rest might be just fine, right? So those are some of the things that I had to break down for myself in order to figure out how am I going to use this, because I know that it's a tool that is going to help me out. So rhythm, it comes in all of our art forms, right? I figured we should get like a base kind of discussion about this. In my art form in theater, it's sort of the orderly reoccurrence of stimuli, which is periodically interrupted or restrained by a departure from the sequence. Oh my gosh, that's so heady. But it's essentially, right, how we feel the story moving forward, the climax, the sort of things that get in the way of our obstacles, right? Our obstacles that come up and how it all kind of plays out. It also shows up in the way the language is set up. When you dissect a script, you know, there are certain things that you're looking for, which I'll talk a little bit later. And then in visual art, I also do some scenic painting, some different things like that. And so really looking at like, when I'm doing that kind of work, I'm thinking about what are the patterns that we're creating? How is our eye moving across whatever it is that we're putting out there for folks? And how does it play when you're doing scenic art, right, with all the other elements that are on stage? And then of course the part I know least about, because let me tell you, I don't play a single instrument. Not one. I took voice lessons as a child. God bless that woman who listened to me like try to sing for years. But We do know that it happens inside of sound and the silence and the emphasis in the song. And those are things that, while I don't know that I feel confident in executing, I do feel that I enjoy them when I try to participate in it, right? Whether I'm failing miserably or not. So that's sort of like a base understanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways that I sort of use the elements of rhythm in order to understand organizational culture, but I've always understood organizations through my art form. It's the way I understand life. You spend 7 years in academics studying something, and like everything goes through that filter, right? So I started out inside of Chaos as a performer. And having to learn, how do I meld into this group, right? All of a sudden you're thrown into this thing. That's me in that unitard. You're welcome. I brought a picture of myself in a unitard.
So good. Love it.
They put me in a show with 2 small children in unitards. You can't imagine the body issues that creates. But now I'm much older and I'm like, I looked good in that unitard. Show people that unitard, right? Yeah. In my early days of my career, rhythm was something that in my training, we started breaking down characters. There's like the Stanislavski method where you're really getting into like the intentions and the tactics and the objectives and all these things. But I had a movement-based teacher when I was in graduate school who would break down characters using tenets of like tempo, rhythm, like what pattern do they move their body in, how heavy or soft are their steps, right? So they were using sort of the language of music to break down characters, and suddenly what felt like this huge, big project, right, which is like to figure out this character, how it aligns with everybody else, how it's gonna move through space, became almost scientific, and there was a lot of comfort in being like, okay, there are these elements that I can break this down into to make sense of where I'm going, and if I can just tap into those things, then I feel a sense of calm and I can be more playful. And when I think about rhythm, that's one of the things I think the most about, is this idea that it's setting out a pattern that then you can deviate from, right? You can have an accent mark, you can do something different. So that was sort of the initial kind of experience. And then during this time, right, all these things look sequential, but it's not. It's like one giant like mashup. I was also a teaching artist out in the community. So I've done lots of work going into schools doing social emotional learning, but also teaching traditional theater, arts in prison, all the gamut of ways that you could go out into the community and teach. That's what I was doing, including some community organizing. And so through this process, one of the things I discovered was that the repetition of the same activities regularly with the kids made for a space for there to be lots of magic, right? So the more I was consistent and the more I came in and I was like, we're gonna have this sort of ritual that we're gonna do together, this sort of rhythm to our time, then suddenly we were just open to having all these magical experiences. And as I sort of started to work in organizations, I started to notice, this was sort of at the same time, that man, if only someone would like lay out for me what the ritual of my work was, right? Like if I only knew, every week you have to have this done. Every month, don't forget these things have to be done. At the end of the year, this has to be done. And if someone could lay that out, I could follow it. Just like my students, when I laid out the rhythm of the class, they could easily follow it. And also at this time, I was working at an organization that their internal rhythm was like, it was just crazy, right? Like everything was fast, everything was intense. And so learning how to structure a lesson started to think in my mind, I was like, okay, if structuring a lesson can be this beneficial for young people, wouldn't it be beneficial for adults too? Wouldn't we like those same elements of structure so that we can understand how we can be successful? The other thing that kind of arose during this time was also the idea of visualizing the structure that we're looking at. And I think, in music, you have your sheet music, right? And you can see everything. And so I started to always putting the lesson on the board, making sure that kids could see where we were headed, that we understood all the things that were about to happen. And that inside of that, they could visualize the pattern and be like, oh yeah, we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. I also started thinking about it as a director. So I was directing theater for young audiences. One of the interesting things about theater for young audiences is that sometimes the scripts, because they're not as funded, they don't get as much workshopping. So sometimes you get a script and you're like, man, I love the idea of this, but like, there's a lot of missing pieces, or we've got to dig in and make this maybe more relevant to our community. And so you're kind of looking at something that you think has got this structure with it, but it maybe doesn't totally fit all of those pieces, right? Yeah. And so in working with actors, one of the things that I really believed in was that it's really not my job to come in and tell them how to do this play, right? It's my job to say, we're a group of humans that are coming in. You have a different understanding of the story. You have a different understanding of the story. I have a different, now we have all these designers who also have a different understanding of the story. So how are we going to get on the same page together and move in? Well, sometimes it felt like moving in. move forward together, right? So this is where I started incorporating into my practice just of leadership a little bit more of listening, of sitting down with the actors at the very beginning of the process and really giving the time to just let them tell me what they thought the story was about, what their character was about, but also to ask them, like, how do you like to work together? Because I think the tricky thing in theater particularly is that we assume we all move to the same rhythm because we're like, you got a theater degree, you've done a bunch of shows, we've all done plays. But what happens is that we've all been trained differently. We all come from different life backgrounds. We all have different histories inside of even just being in a rehearsal room. So really slowing the process down, and rather than jumping into the blocking and the really getting into the characters, spending a day or two building ensemble, learning about each other and understanding, how do you want us to move through? Like, let's build this rhythm together. What are our rehearsal times going to look like? When will you need rest? Right? I think that's one of the biggest things that we can ask people is like, when will you need rest? Because we can, as artists, we can just like go a million miles an hour and assume that everyone has that same energy. And then you meet someone that doesn't, who's really willing to just be like, I need space. And you're like, oh my God, I'm not even upset that you said that to me, which is always surprising, right? The rest is always surprising when someone asks for it and you're just like, oh yeah, of course. Well, I should ask for that. But at any rate, so during this time, that's one of the things I'm thinking about is like, how are we like taking in the information and really listening to the people around us, because they will tell you what the rhythm of a space is or what they want it to be. They will tell you how they want to get into sync together. They will tell you what beats are most important if you really listen to them. And so this idea started to evolve, and I started to have like shows where like the shows were great, but like also the bonds between the people they were staying. I don't know if you've ever done a production before. It's like, I love you, you're the best. And then you never talk to each other again, right? But these humans started having like bonds that extended past the end of the show, which made me go like, oh, something about this process is working, right? Like this investment, this co-creation that we're doing. As time went on, like around this time is where when I was doing a lot of directing, I was still teaching. I was also working on helping a nonprofit get started. And it was in bad shape. It had money due to the IRS. It was not this nonprofit, by the way. This is going to be like the fun part that comes at the end. But they had a lot of issues. And part of that was because the rhythm of the organization as a startup, it was so intense, and there were no rests, and it was a very unsafe, right? Rhythm can create this feeling of safety, like I said at the beginning. There was no feeling of safety. There was no predictable patterns. It was just a series of pulses, right? And I was like, well, I can't keep doing that. This is really hard. But in the process of that, I learned a lot about all those executive director things, right? How to build organizational structure, how to work with donors, how to get grants, how to work the budgets, all that kind of stuff. And I did that for 5 years, and it was pretty successful by the end, but I was burnt out because I hadn't identified what a sustainable personal rhythm was for me inside of that work. So when I got this job at What If Puppets, I took a whole bunch of time. This is a puppet company I came from. They're amazing. They have puppets at the Rose coming up at Rudolph, so go see them. But I took a lot of time to start digging into maybe part of the problem, Megan, is your own internal rhythm issues. Maybe you keep getting into work situations that feel really intense because you're really intense. And what are you going to do in order to do what you're doing for other people, right? All that work in rehearsals and in classrooms, making people feel safe, letting them know what the predictable pattern of things was going to be, when they could take a rest, when they needed to push harder. I wasn't doing that for myself. And so I spent a lot of time in this job. I mean, also the pandemic came during this period, so like that helped with the self-reflection. But I spent a lot of time intentionally communicating what the personal pattern I needed in order to be in my workplace was. So I shared early on with the staff there that like in the mornings, that's when I'm gonna take a rest. Like I'm gonna read, I'm gonna think about you all, and I'm gonna come in prepared so that we're able to engage in a rhythm that is a little more responsive to your needs, right? And that worked pretty well for a while. And then eventually it didn't work because then I became too responsive, right? I was now like just like living inside of their rhythm and really trying to catch up with all of their ideas. And so then we kind of sat down together and I was like, well, what is a structure that we can create for this organization that allows you the most creative safety? Right? Because I was realizing that we were kind of bouncing each other, right? Like they had lots of ideas and then I'd have lots of ideas and then they'd have lots of ideas. And so we sat back and we really like looked at the entirety of the year together and said like, here are the spaces where we need rest. Here are the spaces where I'm happy to be intense. I'm happy to know that the beat is gonna go pretty hard right here if I know the rest is on the other side. And that was a conversation I've never had in any other organization. You know, there'd be people who would be like, when is our dark time? We never have a dark time. When do people get to like refresh and think? And it just occurred to me like, I think that that's a culture that we don't advocate enough as an arts community, is to say to people like, to do art really well takes time and space. It takes being able to think. It takes that space. When you don't have the rest, you're just churning out the same thing over and over and over and over again. So we really got to a point where we were able to establish what that looks like and what that feels like. And so there were a couple of key learnings that came through this process for me, because I really had to think about, okay, A, you might have a knack for doing this, so how are you gonna repeat this process? How are you gonna do it again? And one of the things that I love that my husband says is, let the data speak to you. Says that all the time to me. Whoever like celebrated that. And I thought, data, I hate blah, data. But really what it is right, it's the same process as creating the vision for a production, right? So in that earlier photo where they were playing instruments, this is the data that I used in order to communicate with my team about what the rhythm and the feel of the show was gonna be. So I would go through a process of just collecting images without thinking about what am I really looking for, right? Just like instinctual Pinteresting. Back in the day before Pinterest, it was like, I had a teacher that would put magazines out and she'd be like, just cut out whatever, you know? Yeah, just cut out from your gut whatever you're gonna put. Don't think about it. And then look at it and let the data speak to you, right? So when you look back, you're like, oh, I see that we've got like a repetition of this color, right? We can feel that there's a rhythm in the way that the bottom of that little boat ship has got going on there. And then those things show up, right, later in the scenic design in some different kinds of elements, right? So I was like, well, that's one of my favorite parts about what I do. And I went back and I thought, okay, ways that I've kind of created this in my life have been through this process, through those long dialogues with our actors pre-rehearsal. In community building, we would do community listening parties where we would do big arts events and people would just come and talk, right? And it took all this pressure off of me being like, I'm the leader and this is what we're gonna do. I was like, that's not the parents I grew up with. That's not the environment I grew up with. I don't know how to be that, right? I gotta let that part go. And dig into this piece that like, if we listen, then there's gonna be something magical that comes out of that. I wish I was better at listening to my personal rhythm, but I'm still not very good at that. So some kind of key learnings that I have been thinking about as I'm entering this job. I started here July 20th. I've been here for about 3 months. And I spent the first 3 months here listening. It's really been essentially a 3-month listening tour. And there are certain things that I'm asking people, like what's working, what's not working, how are we perceived in the community? What would be cool? Like, just like, what would be fun to do? What do we want to be? What are the little actions that make up our programs, right? Those little actions are like the beats in a script, right? These are the teeny little things that create the big things that we do. And so I've learned a lot about this community of OCOM and about the things that they have vision for themselves and the places where they're like, you know what, like we've done some really cool things, but we're ready for change. And so in that listening, you start to get data. And that data is conversations, right? The information, the stories from those conversations, but it can't just be that alone. It's also the budget. It's also the marketing materials, like how are we telling the story? There's a visual story that's out there. Surveys, information, feedback from families, the actual curriculum that we use, and the systems, which is misspelled, you're welcome. Chaos. And the systems that we're implementing all of these things with, right? And if I can look at all of those things, then that is telling me something about the rhythm that this organization is moving in right now. One of our big discoveries about OCOM is that it has been growing fast. Ruth did an incredible job of making this like home for musicians where kids feel empowered, and it has been going. And now we need a little bit of a rest. It's time for us to rest a little bit and come up with what is our next pattern gonna be. So in the next month, Ruth and I are doing some big strategic planning. We're gonna be thinking about what does the future wanna look like? What are the patterns that we're gonna create? What are the beats? What's the intensity of how we're gonna grow and change? And what are the things that we're gonna need to do that, right? Who are the people that are gonna come play in our band with us? I don't know. And then we have to create structure, but going back to that idea of like, when you're doing music or theater, you get sheet music, you get a script, you get something that helps you to visualize the pattern, and that we've got to do that for our team here too, right? We've got to build structures that they can see. It's so easy in organizations to just talk about the things that you do, or everybody knows the operational calendar, right? Like, and then you're like, can I see it? And they're like, I don't know. I mean, that happens everywhere, right? I've never been in a job where someone was able to fully visualize sort of what we're doing. So that's one of the things that we're working on, is like, how can we visualize more of what we're doing so that people feel like they can follow the beat of the year, and they can do it either, in syncopation or not, based off of what their work is at the time. So we're looking at systems, meeting cadence. I'm a person that a meeting is so good and it's also so bad. And so when you're thinking about an organization, what are the cadence of the meetings, right? Because that's really some of what's creating the structure of your organization. And then play, try them out, see how it feels. Did we create a rhythm that we can all sing with, that we can all play with? And then when you discover that I hate that. That doesn't feel good. I thought I set up something together with my team that we were gonna be able to create some beautiful music together, but what's really happening is it sounds like a crazy garage band in here, right? That's where we have to go back to step one and listen again and say okay, well, we tried it. We should have done more meetings. I don't know, whatever that is, or what's happening that's keeping us out of rhythm together, right? Like, why can't we have a feeling where we feel safe, where we feel like we have beats and rests, and that we can have accents that we're excited about? What is all of our responsibility in making that happen? And if you do it really well, then things like this can happen. And these are going to be some of our merit scholars talking about music. That's good. We'll stop right there. You can watch the rest of it on YouTube or on Facebook. But at any rate, when we work in rhythm together, really magical things like this are possible. And I couldn't be more honored and excited to be here in Omaha, leading the amazing team here. Final plug, we have a Winter Wellness Festival coming up in February. It's for all ages, so watch for that information to come out. Thank you.